Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, reporting to you from the Overflow Room, which is flowing over as usual. This is the preview video to the insider-only presentation of Neeme Yarvi's 10 best recordings, and you are going to want to see that. So if you are not a ClassicsToday.com insider subscriber, do please consider signing up. There's a link in the description of this video down below, or you can do it on the Classics Today homepage, where you will be able to see not only this video, but the other dozen plus videos we've done on other famous conductors already, plus thousands of dedicated insider reviews with sound clips and all kinds of fun stuff that you can actually read instead of having to look at me. That's got to be worth paying for, don't you think? Anyway, let's talk about Neeme Yarvi. He's a fascinating conductor, in my view, and I particularly want to consider a question which I think about quite a bit in light of the fact that as a major collector, there's more overflow. See, look, there it goes, overflowing in every direction. See, that's the overflow. Oh, and there's more behind me or in front of me, too, another wall of it. And here's the thing. If you're a crazy collector, like I am, and like so many of you are as well, you've got to have an enormous debt of gratitude and lots of love for Neeme Yarvi, because he has, more than any other conductor in the second half of the 20th century, and I mean anybody, he has done more for the cause of unusual but worthy repertoire than anybody, period. There isn't anyone who comes close, because he came along at a very, very fortunate time. He was available when the record industry was exploding, absolutely blowing up, and everybody was making records. Everyone was making records of everything. And eventually they made records of everything that they knew they should make records about. And so they decided to find interesting repertoire to make records about. And they needed somebody who would conduct it and conduct it well, and who knew it and who knew what he was doing. And Yarvi was just the guy. He truly was, because he had this ability to digest vast quantities of unusual music, some of which he must have known before, such as, for example, the symphonies of Edward Tubin, who, like Yarvi, was from Estonia, and some of which he probably learned on the fly, but learn it he did. He also had the right attitude as an interpreter. In other words, his basic overriding principle was to be lively and fresh and exciting, and to let the orchestra play. And that is a critical point in his favor. He was never a micromanager. He knew how to let the orchestra go at the climaxes. And even if getting there might have a couple rough spots here and there, he almost always delivered the goods. He really did, especially in the music that he knew well, and that's Russian music and Scandinavian music in that area. Now, he also happened to come along at a wonderful moment, because not only were the record labels recording everything, but the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s was a time when the cultural flowering in the performing arts of Scandinavia happened. In other words, they were spending piles of money, I mean unbelievable quantities of money, on the arts through their cultural ministries. And I know, because I traveled to Scandinavia on their dime on numerous occasions to observe what was happening. And countries like Finland and Sweden and Norway and Denmark, and they have amazing opportunities to establish orchestras that were extremely good. I mean, they may not have been the Berlin Philharmonic, but they were very, very fine quality. Excellent second-tier orchestras. You call them second-tier because, they're not the major name orchestras. But the fact is, on any given day, they can play as well as anybody in the universe. And they wanted to make a name for themselves, and they needed some proprietary repertoire. And of course, because their budgets were funded on a nationalistic basis, they could get funding if they recorded music by native composers. some of whom were marvelous and who have gotten no attention whatsoever. And they needed a conductor who would play all that music, who wasn't sort of unknown, but who also, wasn't, the biggest name, who would not work with the independent labels that were available to record all of this music because they were all getting state subsidies one way or another. And Yarvi was just the guy. He was fabulous at it. So he had an amazing career. He has an amazing career. He's still making records. Although his career sort of divides into two phases. There was the early, independent label phase, where he did tons of recordings for Biss and for Chandos and labels like that. And then there was his Deutsche Grammophon period, where he did some stuff he hadn't done for those labels and remade a lot of stuff he had done for those labels. Some of it was better, some of it wasn't. But it was a lot of duplication. And then he had a very serious heart attack. And since then, he's sort of been recovering. He's been on the upswing, let's say, with some fairly good things and some less good things. I'm still hoping that he has enough juice to do a really amazing Tchaikovsky Manfred symphony. Because if anybody could bring home the bacon on that piece, it's Neeme Yarvi, if we get the old Neeme Yarvi, the let him play and go crazy Neeme Yarvi. But I think he's a wonderful, wonderful conductor for that reason. He's a collector's dream. He really is. And I have nothing but admiration for the man. I've met him a few times. I've asked him about certain of his performances. I was talking to him about his Mahler, most of which is extremely good. No one talks about it because it isn't a complete cycle. But on Chandos, he did symphonies 1, 3, 4, 5, and 6, I believe. And they're really quite good and very, very exciting. They're a lot like Kondrashin's Mahler, which is quick in that Russian sort of tradition. It's fast and it's take no prisoners, and it's very well recorded and very well played. The thing is, and he told me once, and I asked him about it, why he did certain things. He said, well, it's just to make the music more exciting. I mean, that's a very good reason. I would much rather hear make the music more exciting than make the music more profound or realize all of its intense inner sublimity any day. I'll go for the excitement because, ultimately we have to repeat this experience. And I've found that sublimity doesn't withstand repetition terribly well. Excitement does. It works quite well. Anyway, why is it then that Yarvi does not get the respect that I think he deserves in conductor circles? I think part of the reason is that he does not conduct Beethoven. He does not conduct, well, I'm sure he does, but he has not recorded them. And he does not make a specialty out of the German standard repertoire, which is the standard repertoire by which all conductors, of orchestral music anyway, are normally judged. If they don't do that stuff, they just don't get the same kind of respect. And I think there's some good reasons for that. I understand it. For example, if we're going to evaluate somebody's career, we need to be able to make comparisons. And we need to be able to make comparisons in the same stuff. And the same stuff happens to be, for the most part, the German stuff. That's understandable. People want to make comparisons. But the part that is not really fair is that conductors who don't do that stuff are looked down upon because that stuff is regarded as better music. And that I completely disagree with. I have total, utter disdain for that point of view. I think that's ridiculous, and I think it's untrue, and I think it's unfair. And, the fact that somebody may not have a great affinity for Beethoven or Brahms is not a strike against them. Not at all. As long as they do have affinity for something and they play the living daylights out of what they do have affinity for. And that Yarvi unquestionably has done. Now, he did do a Brahms cycle, you may recall, for Chandos. It wasn't bad. He's conducted Brahms his entire career. If you know those early Yarvi series that was on Melodia or some offshoot of Melodia or some branch or snippet of Melodia, there was a Brahms second and third symphonies on there, and he did them all. He did them all for Chandos, and they weren't terrible. They weren't great. And the reason they weren't great is because, well, there was a lot of Brahms out there to compare it to. What was interesting about his Brahms were like the Schumann overtures that he coupled the Brahms symphonies to, because even then the repertoire was interesting. And he did do a very fine Brahms Hungarian dance disc. But of course, that's another way to damn with faint praise. You say, well, he was really good in the dances, but he wasn't so good in the symphonies. It's really not fair, is it? But he was. I mean, he really was. But the real issue, it seems to me, one of the things that produces this kind of hesitation is that when someone specializes, as Yarvi has, in unusual repertoire, we don't have the comparisons, and we tend to hesitate. Critics and listeners alike tend to be cautious in giving the ultimate accolade to somebody who, says that they're the greatest tube conductor in the whole universe. We have to be able to make the comparisons, and it's a problem. And I'll give you a concrete example. I have it sitting right here, right next to me in this little pile. Yarvi did with the Bamberg Symphony the complete Martinu symphonies. And this was very exciting when it came out because there weren't that many. Until this came out, basically the only other cycle we had was the old Václav Neumann on Superphone with the Czech fill, which is very good. It's very good as a cycle. The interpretations are quite splendid, and the playing of the orchestra is wonderful. But it's an analog recording, a somewhat cavernous and foggy recording. It really was. And this promised to be, a bis sonic spectacular, which in many ways it is. And the Bamberg Symphony, well, we thought they could do this well because the Bamberg Symphony is the old Sudetendeutsch, German symphony orchestra in the Czech lands. They were a Czech orchestra. They all decamped to Germany after Hitler, annexed the Sudetenland, that part of Czechoslovakia, or at that point. So they do have the reputation with Czech repertoire. Not that by this time, like the 90s or whatever it was, it mattered that much. It really didn't. But we had hopes. In the event, this was pretty nice. But then all of the other labels got into the game because, my oh my, Martinu became a thing. And so we got Bryden Thompson on Chandos. We had Arthur Fagan on Naxos. We had Bieloslavek trying 400 times to do a Martinu cycle and finally finishing it with the BBC Symphony on Onyx. And then we had a partial cycle with Klaus-Peter Flor, which was quite good, on RCA. All of that stuff started coming out. Not to mention individual discs with individual recordings of special works. And it turned out that our dear friend Maestro Yarvi was not so great in Martinu. It wasn't as wonderful as maybe we thought it was originally. And there was a good reason for that. The reason is that, like all artists, Yarvi has specific strengths and weaknesses. One of his weaknesses, and it's just the way it is that he's not a precision conductor, and he's not really adept at wading through music that is extremely texturally busy, because he tends to be a little bit approximate in matters of rhythm. And Martinu is nothing if not precise. His music is extremely dense. It's always full of figurations and patterns, and those figurations and patterns need to be sorted out. And that just wasn't what he was really great at. These are not bad performances by any stretch of the imagination. And they do reveal his very true gifts. That is, to keep the music moving, to generate excitement, to drive home those climaxes. They sound fabulous. All of that's there. All of that's there, but that's not entirely who Martinu is. And so these performances are not really idiomatic when we were able to compare them to later versions. I have compared Yarvi's Tubin cycle to the new Tubin cycle on Alba. That holds up very well. And one of the things I found is that in the repertoire that Yarvi was doing when nobody else was doing it, generally speaking, the Martinu is an exception. His performances have held up extremely well. A lot of his Sibelius, some of the unusual Sibelius, is still fantastic. It works really, really well. His Stenhammer is marvelous. He did I mean, there's so many things that he did. I'm going to talk about some of them in the other video on ClassicsToday.com. So I don't want to get into it in that much detail to give away some of the secrets that you'll see in that video. But the fact of the matter is, his strengths are unbelievably strong. And what he's done well has held up extremely well in the unusual repertoire department. And that's very, very gratifying, because what that means is that essentially we are underestimating him. We have underestimated him to the extent that our caution when it comes to unusual repertoire has prevented us from giving him the acknowledgement that he deserves as a truly compelling and charismatic and great conductor in that late Romantic style. He's never pretended to be good at the classical period. He doesn't do Haydn and Mozart and those people. He doesn't do Baroque music. He's not interested in the period instrument movement. None of those things. But what he does extremely well, and he does a ton of stuff extremely well. So I really hope that this has given you a little bit of insight into how we may be misjudging this guy, and how much more credit he deserves for all the wonderful things he did when we had the opportunity to do it. I really think that we have been so lucky that he came along when he did and did as much repertoire as he was able to during that golden 2 or 3 decades between the late 70s and the early 2000s, when the classical music industry just had lots of money to throw at stuff, all kinds of interesting stuff. I mean, he did one of the best Max Reger discs I've ever heard with the Concertgebouw. I mean, that's great stuff. And, nobody cares. It's a shame. But we care. We're collectors. We care, don't we? So please, if you aren't a ClassicsToday.com Insider subscriber, consider subscribing. And I will see you over at ClassicsToday.com for the 10 best recordings so far of Neeme Yarvi. Mind you, I am not writing his obituary. I hope he's around for a lot longer to do a lot more, especially that Tchaikovsky-Manfred Symphony. Please, Maestro Yarvi, do Manfred and go crazy. So keep on listening, folks. Thanks so much for joining me. See you over on the other website. Bye-bye.